certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Leather gloves, hair found in the boot of a car, and a brick stained with blood. Just some of the items that police sent for urgent forensic testing in their search for a serial killer. This is day 47 of Claremont in Conversation. It's Natalie, Tim and Alison in the studio with you today. Can we start by talking about this blood-stained brick, which we've never heard of before? How did this come up?
Well, this came up in the document that was showing a series of emails that was coming from the police of everything they sent in to be tested. And I suspect there was like a heck of a lot of stuff that every time they found something, they sent it off to be tested. And I did speak to one of the defence lawyers after, and I said, what was this blood-stained brick? And she said, oh, it wasn't really a brick, it was a small piece of, she thought it was an old tyre or something, but she played it down. But of course, this came out because they were sweeping the area, both areas, and I should imagine everything they found in that bushland would have been sent off to be tested. But what came out today was the police were getting a bit antsy about why it was taking so long. So we heard today for the first time these series of emails back and forth. Can we get this tested? What about Ciara Glennon's fingernails from 40 to 50? What's happening? And that was the first time we saw the pressure that was being put on. The Macro were getting frustrated because it was taking a while. The PathWest people seemed to be thinking, well, stand in line, we've got priority and stuff and things like that. So that's what came out basically today, Tim.
Yeah, it was in that context that Mr. Jovich has been trying to paint this picture of a lab under pressure to get results, busy, understaffed. Mr. Bagdonavivius yesterday admitted that, maybe when I was putting this matrix together, this evidence matrix, I did make it a bit rushed, and it was in that context that these emails were introduced, and up they flashed on the screen, and there was the list, which included this brick. Now we know where Ciara was found it was pretty remote bushland, but it wasn't remote enough that other activity didn't go on there. Obviously, she was discovered because a member of the public thought he might be scoring some free cannabis if he went looking hard enough, which is what he was there to do. And pictures from the time show bits of rubbish and bottles, and there was a tyre quite close to where Ciara was discovered. But you'd think you'd know the difference between a brick and a tyre, and the fact that it had blood on it was obviously piqued the interest of the coppers. And this was a priority list that they were
wish list that
formulating together between PathWest, what they had, and the police saying, well, what can we do? And there were 10 of these lists, so that gives you an idea, and there was dozens of things on each list. So just the various rabbit holes that the police went down or tried to get PathWest to go down for them, they just keep expanding over the days and weeks of this trial, and today was we found another hole basically. And
of course anyone that reads any crime thrillers or sees TV always sees the sparring that goes on between police and want the cause of death and the time of death now, and the forensic pathologists say just wait, it takes time. Some of the testing took, he said, up to a week to do a few things, so it's not like instant, we can tell you right now. But police were obviously desperate in their search to find the killer, and so they wanted all of the results yesterday, to keep going.
And we heard back then that there was only a handful of staff at PathWest back then, and you can only imagine if police are sending in volumes of items and they want them tested, and they do want the answers urgently because we are looking for a serial killer.
Yeah, and that was exactly the tenet of Mr. Jovich's questions. He went back there a number of times. This was in the context of a murder, maybe 3 murders. You wanted it solved. Yes, of course. You took care. Yes, of course. But you did this, and you did this, and Mr. Jovic again then went back to some of the errors he found amongst some of the paperwork. He returned to these blanks that were sent to the New Zealand today, which had DNA in them, and Mr. Bagdonavivius was quizzed about those, what he'd done. So it's all Mr. Jovic's attempt to break down the smooth scientific lab coat, perfectly hermetically sealed lab that Mr. Bagdonavivius says was the ideal, but I mean the ideal, it wasn't perfect, and there were mistakes made, and we're all human, and they obviously were as well, and wanted to get results but weren't getting them.
And under the relentless barrage, there were some concessions today. He did concede that yes, it's possible that mistakes are made. Have you ever made a mistake? Yes, it's possible. And of course brought up we're looking at fragments of fingernails. We're talking about microscopic, aren't we? We're not talking about a gun or a knife here. We're talking about microscopic bits of fragments of evidence. So when he was talking about that, even when you look the scrapings under this tiny fragment, it was only a tiny bit of DNA too. So no doubt we'll be hearing more about that tomorrow night, won't we?
Yes.
And if you think about in your own life, if someone is questioning your work practices and trying to paint a picture that maybe you didn't do things as well as you could have back then, I imagine most of us would feel defensive. I'm curious as to whether, this witness gave the impression that he was feeling defensive
Not
about
really.
his practice back
Not
then.
really.
Or was he quite cool?
Yeah, I think he was quite confident.
He was calm, but there were moments, just flashes. There was one this morning when he was basically asked about AGM 40 and 48 and why Mr. Bagdonavivius is personally ascribed to that debris only, not for analysis, or no use for analysis. And there was a way that he prescribed it on the form that Mr. Jovic took issue with or questioned him about, and there was just a little flash to say, well, yes, of course I was going to keep that evidence. I wasn't going to throw it away. It might come to something in the future, and that decision might proved to be one of the most important of all, because we know AJM 40 and 48 were two that went away to the UK, which we're going to start to hear about tomorrow, which are the vital pieces of evidence. So there were moments that he was getting a little bit testy, but to be fair, given the amount of time that he's done in this trial now, probably the longest witness over a span of days that we've had so far, given that there was a little break in the middle, but he was still working while we were off, going through reams and reams of documents and producing another statement late last week. He got through it. There was some sighs on the witness stand, but I think there'll be a sigh of relief now that he's finished. There certainly was in the media room. I'll give you the tip.
You talked about the leather gloves yesterday, and as you told us, there was no results as a result of that testing of the gloves. Was there any information or any results that you were made aware of that came out of these urgent testings?
Not that we've heard of. The very opening, Mr. Jovic talked about DNA from a victim of an unrelated crime being in the mix, with some vegetation to do with Jane Rimmer, but we've yet to hear that. But no, nothing.
Well, there was a little bit more information about the gloves contained in these emails today. That the fact there were a pair of gloves, there were two gloves, but according to the email, there were one of each. There was a brown one and a black one, but there were, as we speculated yesterday, this note between PathWest and Detective Sanderson, who was one of the forensic officers, did prescribe that quite a high priority, given where it was found, close to where Jane's body was found. And obviously gloves, I mean, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to understand or imagine what the significance of those were. But the results, they're still a mystery. We don't know when they were tested. We don't know if they were tested, and we certainly don't know what results came from them. But we do know that they're not connected in evidence-wise in any way to Mr. Edwards. It was just another rabbit hole that the police were shining a torch down.
And a mystery that will be unanswered. Now, one of the police officers who we've mentioned in a previous podcast, Sergeant Maripodi, was asked to leave the court today. What was that for?
Well, that was in relation to this lock of hair, or this sample of hair that was eventually returned to Ciara's mum and dad, Dennis and Una. We've heard about it previously. It was also done with Jane, which was a little bit of a shock to all of us when that first came out. We've had some back-channel communication to say that it's not that peculiar, but it still strikes me as peculiar.
Especially in a murder case.
Well, in this murder case
yes.
in particular. But this was, the questioning was in the context of, it was Mr. Bagdonavivius who signed out the hair that eventually part of it went back to the Glennons. He used a form that was about another piece of hair, this piece of hair that you mentioned at the top, Matt, that was found in the boot of a car, which we'll get to in a minute. So he'd used the wrong form, but then he was quizzed as to, well, why did the whole hair mass leave the lab, which it apparently did. So there was confusion about whether it was a lock of hair or the whole hair mass. It turns out it was the whole hair mass. Then it was questioned to him, well, why that process? Why would you just sign out a billy bucket without even knowing what was in it? And Mr. Bagdonavivius' answer was, well, basically, I trusted Karen Margolius, I trusted Detective Maripodi, they were telling me what it was for. I used the wrong form, he admitted that, but I had no doubt what was in the bucket and what they said that they were going to do with it, and 2 days later, the bucket came back. It might not seem that important now, but in a few weeks, I'm wagering it will become very important, because the location and the continuity of that hair mass is vitally important when it comes to fibres, because the fibres that were found in Ciara's hair on further examination many years later potentially and allegedly link Mr. Edwards to her and the bucket. So the fact that the bucket left the lab for 2 days was dealt with in some way. We think a lock of hair was taken, sent to a funeral parlour to be treated, and then given to the Glennons.
There was no paper trail, though, was there?
Exactly, and the paper trail, where it went, well, we know who took it, we know when they took it, but we don't know where they took it then, we don't know what they did with it. We know Detective Maripodi is going to be a witness, possibly the very last witness for the prosecution, so no doubt that will be explored when the time comes.
And of all the exhibits, to not have a paper trail, this one is quite critical. So
especially when this is a trial. I've never seen so many paper documents at a trial. It's almost like one of these huge financial corporate things where we're following bits of paper every day, document after document after document. Every single item is, poured over the analysts being analysed, literally, over this whole event.
So your understanding is, or just so people can understand, Sergeant Maripodi would have been asked to leave the court because this is evidence that he will be asked about.
He will be questioned about, correct. He's one of the officers that's been given exemption to be able to be in the court. We talked about that. He's obviously been a long-standing police officer, very involved in this case, but for that particular portion, Mr. Jovich made the informal request of him, apparently. He was absolutely happy to do it, and took a seat on the leather couch outside for half an hour.
Yeah. So the hair that was tested, which was found in the boot of a car, what more can you tell us about this, if anything? Yeah,
that was an interesting one as well. We got a hint of it the other day, but
they just come and then it disappears.
Yeah.
You don't get it.
It's very frustrating.
We don't even say, we can't get up and say, and?
Well, if we did, if we had that choice, the trial might go for about 3 years. But so this was less than 2 weeks after Ciara's body was discovered. Macro detectives got a call from a chap who was driving a car that wasn't his. He was either borrowed it or was minding it for another person. And a lock of hair, a clump of hair, a few hairs were in the boot of this car that he'd obviously found. Now, obviously, Ciara's disappearance, then murder, and discovery would have been, the only topic of conversation in Perth for those 2 weeks and many weeks after. And so he rang the police and said, I found this hair in the boot. and I think the owner of the car might have something to do with it. And so Macro, again, another rabbit hole that they went down. They took the hair, they apparently placed it in an A4 piece of paper, which was folded several times, and handed over to PathWest, and they were asked to do tests on it. Mr. Bagdonavivius said today there was about 5 hairs in that little packet. He tested them. He said at least one of them was definitely animal hair, possibly another one, and the other 3, well, obviously, it would appear came to nothing.
Another one of those urban myths that we were talking about the other day.
Exactly. But this one turned to have sounds like it's got a bit more meat on the bones. What the owner of that car might have thought when he had when he got a call from Macro detectives. In that portion of 1997, you can only imagine. But it
wasn't a white station wagon, was it?
Well, we don't know, do we? But I'm betting he didn't lend that car out again.
I guess these kinds of small snippets of information could be the germ from where these urban myths have grown.
Oh, people want to help. They want to be part of it, and it's usually a friend of a friend of a friend. And after you chase it down, it's nothing. You never track it down.
And police were desperate for the help and asking for the help on at every opportunity they could. So
and it was widespread.
Yeah,
so widespread.
So it's not surprise. I mean, I delving into the files as we'd want to, and we have been through the court process. I'm sure there'll be dozens more of tip-offs like that. But it was this particular one got as far as PathWest doing testing. So at the time they obviously thought it had some legs.
Obviously a lot more, but we saw these emails just because they were brought out showing the pressure from the police trying to get some response or quicker response from PathWest today. That's where we heard these odd items, but I should imagine there'd be hundreds of others that were sent along and tested that just haven't been documented.
Yeah. So Defence today obviously were very strong in their pushing this idea of cross-contamination and how the contamination will have muddied the waters. Was Mr. Bagdonavivius quite strong in his defence of PathWest and their track record?
Well, he was and he wasn't. He did concede that mistakes, I mean, it is an exact science, I suppose, rather than what we do or anybody else does, where they do have to be very, very careful. And he said quality always came over anything. Also with the quantity, they did have a lot of cases. They knew that it was a priority. But he said, yes, mistakes are made. And Mr. Jovic said, and you have made them. And he said, yes, we have. He was quite honest in that way that, they were trying to do the best they could, and even under the pressure, they still tried to maintain the quality that was expected of them.
Yeah, and in particular, it was these nails that were sent to New Zealand in 2004 that he was being quizzed about, and on the back of that, these blank samples, these so-called blank samples that are there to help determine if there is any contamination. And we learned during the evidence a couple of weeks ago that there was 35 samples sent away, blank ones, which Mr. Bagdonavivius was responsible for sending, collating and sending. 21 of them tested and 4 of them were contaminated.
Which he pressed home, didn't he? 4 out of 21, he said, is a lot higher.
Which is a high percentage. And then Mr. Bagdonavivius today was asked, what are the international standards? He said 3 or 4 out of 100 he would expect, but then without prompting, he did happen to mention that quite recently PathWest have been tested and their current level of contamination is about 1 or 2 in every 100. So he said, as international standards go right now, we're about 50% better than is expected of us, which is great, brilliant, thank you, excellent in 2020, but we're talking about 2003. So and for whatever reason, those samples were contaminated. There was documentation today that confirmed that at least one of them definitely was contaminated at PathWest because they'd done runs of the blank themselves that Mr. Bagdonavivius wasn't aware of and didn't send to New Zealand, but it showed that there was contamination before it left Perth. So that's where it sits. All those exhibits are now before Justice Hall, and he will make of them what he will when it comes to the time. But it builds into Mr. Jovic's narrative of a lab under pressure, He's mentioned Martin Blooms, the previous witness, had maybe been dragged off the case or asked to leave the case by the police. That hasn't really been confirmed yet. Mr. Bagdonavivius, it was put to him. He didn't know one way or the other. He said, "I don't know. I was just asked to do this work personally. I don't know why. I don't know what the context was." So there's that little area that Mr. Jovich has managed to slip into the mix, but. As I say, Justice Hall will make of it what he will when he comes to hand down his verdict.
Well, let's not forget too Mr. Jovich's opening when he came out very strongly and said, "You've got the wrong man."
Well, and that's the simplest defence you could possibly, or one of the simplest defences you could possibly have in one of the most complex cases in Australia.
That's right. Well, a bit of a shake-up tomorrow. So how will court accommodate these UK witnesses?
Well, Ali's going to have a nana nap in the morning because we have a late sitting tomorrow. So we move on to the UK portion of the DNA evidence tomorrow, and this is the Forensic Science Service that did the testing on the nails in 2008 that turned up this low copper number testing that turned up this amazing breakthrough in 2008. So tomorrow we start with that. We've got one UK-based witness has flown to Perth, and she will start, and then we will jet back to the UK for a couple of video witnesses, which will mean we sit late into the night, about 9 o'clock Perth time, to accommodate the time difference, and then Mrs. Evans, Carol Evans, who was the reporting scientist, so she was overseeing the work that was being done on the nails, so she was the boss basically of this project. She will then continue her evidence on Thursday, which will be hugely interesting. Similar, obviously, type of evidence. We think lots of charts and swabs and things like that. But this is the crucial bit. This is the evidence. This is the crucial evidence that the prosecution say ties it all together. This is where we get Mr. Edwards from. Then it takes us back to Karrakatta and all the way through. So, yeah, I mean, it's a hugely important portion of the trial that starts tomorrow afternoon.
You could almost sense something building up this week, which intrigued us all because all of the family members were in there. Big presence of police, the macro. We haven't seen that for a long time, right from the opening days, where the Rimmers, the Glennons, and as I said, almost two rows of police. We kept waiting to see what was happening. That it hasn't been that crowded for a long time.
Why do you feel that presence is?
Well, we're waiting.
I get the feeling that they know we're coming to the really crucial bit now. If this goes well for the prosecution, then their case is immeasurably stronger than if this evidence is somehow weakened. There's no suggestion of any stuff-ups in London or the UK from either openings. And as we discussed, FSS was one of the pioneering DNA outfits of their time. They revolutionised DNA testing with their use of LCN low copy number technique. So no wonder Brendan and his students will probably be sort of knocking on the door of the court on Thursday, because they're going to want to hear from some of the best in the world at what they were doing at that time. As I say, we start with the boss, and then the man who actually did the testing that found this DNA, a guy called Andrew Talbot. He will be the first video witness tomorrow. So yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how it goes.
Well, we'll all reset our body clocks, which now are in tune to the court, and push it all back a bit later. Tim and I will be back tomorrow for Day 48, along with Damien Cripps, and we look forward to chatting to you then.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the Trial, follow the live blog. Watch the nightly news updates and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.